Do you hear that?
Yes, it's A Quiet Bird Box Place 2, aka The Silence, starring Sabrina the Teenage Witch and Nigel from The Devil Wears Prada.
Gird your loins!
In this video, we'll be taking a deep dive into The Silence's ending and explaining the monsters and some of the details you may have missed along the way. So hold your tongue and do what the Reverend tells you, because here we go. In order to understand the ending and how the Andrews family makes their way to the refuge, we must first see where the characters started and how they changed along the way. Now, at first glance, you might think that Allie, played by Kiernan Shipka, is the protagonist. After all, she narrates the film and is the first character we see on the screen. But the real protagonist of this story is Hugh. He's the character that undergoes the most significant change. In the beginning, Hugh is weak and a total pushover. This is shown in the scene where he lets a business colleague, Max, walk all over him, even though the engineering problem they're having was totally Max's fault. Glenn here provides the perfect foil for Hugh. Whereas Hugh is weak and afraid to stand up for himself, Glenn is strong and doesn't take shit from no one. He even tells Max to cut the crap.
Why don't you cut the shit, Max?
Did I mention he loves guns? Hugh also tells his son Jude about the first time he met Glenn. Hugh was being picked on by a group of bullies, and Glenn came to save the day. This is mirrored by Allie, who also gets picked on by a group of bullies at the beginning. When he's told by his wife Kelly, played by Aunt Zelda from Sabrina, which if you haven't seen my Sabrina video, go check it out, that his daughter has been picked on yet again, he doesn't do anything about it. He just sighs and continues on. Whereas Glenn over here, when Allie's in trouble, literally shoots a guy in the leg. To make matters more awkward, Jude wants to be like Glenn because he's strong and brave, not like his timid dad. After Glenn's death, Jude says he misses Uncle Glenn, and so does Hugh. Glenn was the dominant figure, willing to take on the monsters, and now he's gone. If this family is going to survive in this new, harsh world, Hugh will need to adapt along with it. And he starts to take steps in this direction, leaving the safety of the car to create diversions for them to escape and risking his life to get the antibiotics for his wife. But it's not really until the end of the film that Hugh fully embraces his newfound courage. When his daughter is taken by a man simply known as the Reverend, Hugh, with vesps flying all around and the assailants armed with knives, tackles the Reverend in an attempt to save his daughter. He even gets stabbed in the process. But what I think is most intriguing is how, after the Reverend has been downed, Hugh goes back and continues to whack him in the face over and over again with the butt of his gun. It's almost as if years of pent rage are finally being released in this one cathartic moment. The following scenes show Hugh in his new, better self. He leads his family through the forest, has grown a beard, which is commonly associated with being manly, and keeps watch in the night. He's come a long way from the man who was always a follower, like how he always listened to Glenn and followed him in his car.
I'll follow you.
Even the type of cars shows this dichotomy. Glenn in a big 4x4 while Hugh's in his minivan. Allie doesn't go through as much change as her father. In fact, she's already gone through her change before the film even begins. She tells us that 3 years ago she was in a car accident with her grandparents. Both of them died and she lost her hearing. She had to learn sign language and adapt to a new world. This idea of adapting is echoed in her ending narration. She wonders if the Vesps will evolve like she did with her hearing. However, with them, it would be evolving to the cold. Now, this final scene is meant to be hopeful as both Allie and Rob take down a Vesp. However, I find it a little bit concerning. The Vesp had successfully laid eggs inside the dead body of a wolf, where there's clearly snow around. Is this suggesting that the Vesps are getting better at raising their young in colder climates? I guess we'll have to just wait for the Silence Batbox Place 2. Jude also has his own little character arc when he stabs one of the bad guys, mustering the courage to become more like his hero, Glenn, with a spear fashioned by his dad, I might add. The use of grandma is also a good example of a writing technique called set up and pay off. In one of the first scenes, we learn Hugh needs to pick up her prescriptions. Then we see her smoking, then an inhaler, and of course her coughing. Putting these clues together, we can surmise she has some sort of lung disease, perhaps cancer, and that she is dying. This comes in handy later when A, they need a lighter, and B, she sacrifices herself. She's going to die anyway. This just makes her end more heroic, and because it was properly set up in little clues throughout the story, it doesn't seem forced. Both Hugh and Kelly are also overprotective of their daughter. Kelly never wants her driving due to the accident, is suspicious of her boy Rob, and you can even see on her tablet that she's always checking up on her. Contrast this to the end of the film where Allie is out with Rob, taking down Vesps like a total badass. My guess is that her parents have eased up a little knowing their daughter can take care of herself. But before we get into the monsters, it's important to look at some of the major themes and ideas expressed throughout this film, and a lot of them can be summed up in the introduction credits, which display quick images of babies, technology, pollution, DNA, eaten animals, riots, and war. This contrast between animal and man, nature and technology, is prevalent throughout the entire film. The Vesps, the creature responsible for this so-called apocalypse, are referred many times as a plague and infestation, feeding off other living things in order to survive. But who is the real plague here? Who are the real animals? The intro suggests that we are. We bury our heads in technology, oblivious to how our world is changing around us. We riot, we kill, we start wars. How are we any different than the Vesps? As Allie says at the end of the movie, will we remember what it is that separates us from them? She says maybe, but it will be a question of whether who will adapt first, because if we keep going the way we're going, we're doomed. If we don't change, we'll perish. The film also has a negative view on technology, starting even in the first scene when Kelly is pissed Jude spends most of his time playing video games. In today's modern age, we've simultaneously become more connected and disconnected. We give more value to our screens than to each other. The release of the Vesps forces the Andrews family to be without technology for much of the film, to rely on the bare essentials. Allie briefly discusses the loss of technology when she tells her dad about the Grey, what people are calling an expanse completely devoid of power and satellite signal. Hugh says it's like we're back in the Dark Ages. We'll come back to that point in a bit. But now let's talk about the Vesps themselves. The beginning of the film sees a group of cavers digging into the rock wall of an uncharted cave system in Pennsylvania, 1,000 feet beneath the Appalachian Trail. They unearth thousands of bat-like creatures who have managed to stay alive for possibly hundreds of thousands of years. They've evolved in such a way as to see through sound. After being unleashed, the Vesps cause havoc on the world, having to adapt quickly to their new environment. They use human and animal bodies to carry the eggs of their children, which quickly spawn new offspring. The most scientific explanation of the Vesps we get is when Allie reads an article from Science Insider, written by Dr. J.P. Leader, which states the word Vesps come from the Spanish word for wasp, avispa. He says they are bat-like, malicious, prehistoric flying reptiles that swarm like wasps and attack like piranha. These carnivores act purely on survival instinct. They hunt in giant packs, spreading like a deadly plague. He goes on to state that it's currently unknown how they reproduce, but several ranchers have reported them laying their young in the husks of their cattle. And we see this later on, particularly in the scene where Allie and Hugh uncover the offspring inside the dead bodies at the drugstore. The introduction of the Vesps also causes a stir amongst the religious community, with many calling it the apocalypse or end of days. On her tablet, there is even an article about religious extremists breeding Vesps in order to usher in the apocalypse, which is seen as a sign from God. The article at the bottom reads, "We are the plague, Vesps are the cure." This use of the word plague, which is brought up at least a dozen times throughout the film, is not coincidental. And when Hugh said the event makes him think of the Dark Ages, I can't help but think of another plague that happened at that time, the bubonic, aka the Black Death. The Black Death killed a third of the European population at the time, and the result caused renewed religious fanaticism. With doctors and governments at the time unable to explain what caused the plague, many turned to religion for an answer, believing the epidemic was punishment by God for their sins, with the cure only obtainable through salvation and winning God's forgiveness. The church sign here reads, "Will suffering ever end? Who is really in control? Join us and survive." It's almost as if they are saying they have the answers, like the religious leaders back in the day thought they had the answers. Oh, and it's wheelchair accessible. Many parallels also occur between the Black Plague, Vesps, and religion, most notably through the character the Reverend and his flock called the Hushed. Hushed meaning to be calm and silent, and also because they cut their friggin' tongues out. He asks if Hugh and Allie want to join, and Allie's like, he's weird. He then shows a passage from Psalm chapter 3 verse 8, "From the Lord comes deliverance." And if you were to read the two verses that actually come before it, it gets a whole lot creepier. They read, "I will not fear, though tens of thousands assail me on every side." Perhaps the Vesps? Arise, Lord, deliver me, my God. Strike all my enemies on the jaw, break the teeth of the wicked. And guess whose teeth and jaw likely get broken at the end of the movie? The Hushed arrive, this time at the cottage, and ask Hugh and the family to join them, to follow their example. And when Hugh says to leave them alone, we get this creepy message. The girl is fertile. Fertile? Hugh moves from his flaw of being weak and timid by getting out his shotgun, but it becomes a stalemate since if he were to shoot it, it would unleash the Vesps, a fact the Reverend full well knows since he smiles when he sees the gun pointed at him. The Hush leave, and at night we get our first mention of the refuge. Rob is making his way up there and wants Allie to come. Since Vesps can't handle the cold, it's the perfect place for survivors. But the Hush plant a Trojan horse in the form of a young girl strapped with cell phones which alert the Vesps, which is kind of silly if you're the Hush since we know they want the young fertile women. Why potentially sacrifice both this young girl and Allie, plus others, just to get her? Doesn't make any sense, but hey, that's a Netflix horror for you. And as we all know, Hugh and the fam band together to stop the flock once and for all, saving Allie and eventually making their way to the refuge, a mountaintop solar-powered haven for their survivors, most likely in Canada or far north in the United States. And the family must have traveled a long distance because there aren't any mountains like this in New Jersey. So that's my take on The Silence, but I want to hear what you guys thought in the comments below. Make sure to smash that like button, but quietly because we don't want to alert the Vesps, and subscribe because I have more videos, deep dives, and breakdowns on the way. You can also follow me on Twitter at ThinkStoryYT. Until next time, remember, Daddy loves you very much.